Welcome, everybody, to the Inner Carnivore Podcast. My special guest today, Mitchell Thompson. Before I get in with Mitchell, whether you guys are streaming this on your favorite streaming platform or watching the full video on YouTube, do a huge favor. Like, subscribe, send the show to someone, leave a review. It helps immensely. And every time you guys do it, I appreciate it more than you guys know. Jumping right in with Mitchell. How are you doing, Mitchell?
I'm doing good, man. I appreciate you having me on.
No, I appreciate you coming on. Yeah, we connected on Instagram a few weeks ago, and you kind of told me about your story and this documentary that you have out. Let me make sure I get the title right. How Keto Cured My Crohn's, which I think is an awesome topic because there's actually, I don't know if you've seen it, I'm sure you have. There was a video going around that Eddie Abu made about Crohn's, and numerous fitness influencers remixed and stitched that video and just absolutely blasted him about going keto, carnivore, low carb for Crohn's. And you're not the only person that I've heard. There's several other people who have gotten Crohn's diseases reversed or symptoms eliminated, for however you want to phrase it, by going this way. And it makes sense to me. So it's awesome to actually talk to somebody who's personally gone through it. And so, that kind of leads it. How did you end up going keto? And what was your story on getting to keto and how that progressed through curing your Crohn's?
Well, again, I appreciate you having me on, man, because the content you post is essentially the sort of content that educated me, or at least piqued my interest in the early stages with regards to just different altering dietary approaches. So I'm a personal trainer, health professional, so I already had a decent understanding of nutrition fundamentally before I even got diagnosed with Crohn's. And last November in 2023, I had what I thought was just the stomach flu. I thought I had gastroenteritis. I figured that the symptoms I was experiencing were no different than symptoms of gastroenteritis I had in the past. And, once the doctors essentially told me, we did all the MRIs, we did all the CT scans, we did all the testing we can do, we're pretty confident you have Crohn's disease. And until we get a colonoscopy, we won't be able to officially diagnose, but we're going to approach this as if you have Crohn's, and all the protocols we're going to essentially hint at you getting geared towards are going to be what people with Crohn's disease experience. And so, it started off me following their protocol. They said, eat fiber. Some doctors said, don't eat fiber. They told me to eat a Burette diet, which is bananas, rice, apple, toast. It's like all carbs and sugar, starches, right? And I followed their protocol. And I don't know, are you familiar with the Jordan Rubin from the late 90s, early 2000s?
I don't think I've heard of him.
Yeah, well, irrelevant, because this dude is in the same sort of boat where he had Crohn's, but he was able to, because of his family background and all this stuff, he was able to travel all over the world and learn from different doctors the most implicating protocols for resolving IBD, let alone Crohn's. And so in the late 90s, early 2000s, he espoused what was known as the Maker's Diet. And that was the first sort of Crohn's recovery protocol that I embarked on, that I discovered. And it was the same shit the doctors were saying. It was talking about drinking super greens and having all these vegetables in your diet and starting out your day with fiber. And so I did that, and I got sicker. And I initially had lost 20 to 30 pounds, but when I followed the doctor's protocol and this Maker's Diet protocol, I lost another 20 to 25 pounds and got all the way down to 153 pounds. And I'll never forget being bedridden and seeing, Dr. Robert Sives, right? Is that how you say it? Sives, right? Because the V in South African, I think, is pronounced, or the W is pronounced with a V.
I honestly don't know how to pronounce it. I don't know how to pronounce most people's names. I got to look stuff up. I'm Googling stuff how to pronounce,
Especially scientific terminology, right? Is is 90, it catabolism?
90% of my videos, I'm is it adiposity or adiposity? Or, and I'm Googling, listening to it so I sound like I have somewhat idea what I'm talking about.
For sure. So Robert Sives, I remember watching a video on him, the carb addiction doc. And the title was, can this cure your Crohn's, or can keto cure your Crohn's? Something to that degree. And man, I watched this video 4 times back to back just to make sure what I was hearing, to make sure that I wasn't mishearing what he was essentially articulating. And what he was saying was the opposite of what all those doctors were saying. He was saying that fiber, and this made way more sense. He was talking about how with Crohn's, you have what are known as strictures, meaning your intestinal lining. You have this, I mean, your intestines are like a food tube, as you know. So with Crohn's, anytime food is being peristaltically, there's another word, right? Is being peristaltically moved through the intestines, when the intestines are naturally pushing the food through your food tube. With Crohn's, you have strictures, which are essentially the tightening of that food tube of your intestines. And Robert Seides was like, why would I put fiber in my body if I have Crohn's with these strictures if the fiber can't be processed and it's further exacerbating the peristaltic movements with regards to nearly forcing them in a circumstance where they can't really be forced? And so I would eat fiber and all these BS and I would cramp so bad. And in this video, Dr. Robert Seides did a really good job articulating that Crohn's cramping, which I put in the documentary, is the telltale sign of the suffering that people with IBD, let alone with Crohn's, what they experience. And that's something universal that unless you've actually endured that level of pain, it's almost impossible to articulate how terrible it is. And so he's articulating this to me as somebody who's experiencing the cramping as I'm watching it. And I'm just thinking, he seems to have the right idea with regards to being able to articulate what I'm experiencing. And he says he has clients who he's helped with whatever protocol he's about to talk about. And he essentially alluded to the idea of a ketogenic diet. And that discovery took me down a rabbit hole where I ate red meat, salt, and water. I found Dr. Anthony Chafee, so I started eating red meat, salt, and water. Then I found Dr. Ken Berry, so I started adding in other forms of meat. And lo and behold, after 2 weeks of a very strict carnivore diet, my symptoms were nearly gone.
So what did doctors say? What you go to them, right? So you have a doctor who tells you to eat this, right? It's literally reading off a script. Honestly, I swear they go on WebMD. They're like, all right, so what do I do for Crohn's? All right, cool. They said you should do fiber, right? So you start doing fiber. And then your symptoms don't get better. And they're like, yeah, well, it's Crohn's. It's just going to be a lifelong condition. We're going to try and manage it, right? And then you do something and you're like, hey, doc, all my symptoms are better. What do they say? And here's the problem. So I've talked to so many people who have had some sort of digestive issue, whether it's chronic constipation or IBS or IBD or Crohn's. I talked to another guy who had Crohn's. Or all of these issues that have gotten better going either keto or carnivore. And their doctors just go, really? And then just go on about their day. And they're like, oh, well, I guess if it's
Why
working.
do you think that is?
So I think this is another rabbit hole, right? I think if you start doing these things that you are taught in school, right? Whether you have an bachelor's in nutrition or science or whether you have a PhD, you're taught certain fundamentals, right? Eat your whole grains, eat lean proteins, get enough fiber, right? Fiber is the most parroted thing on earth.
I got in 5 arguments with people on your comments section arguing fiber.
It's unreal. You have registered dietitians that will get on there and say, the reason we're sick is because of fiber. We're not eating enough fiber. And so you have these basic fundamentals. Everybody comes out of school thinking that, right? You got to eat your whole grains. You got to, limit processed foods, but you got to eat lean meats. Don't eat the fatty ones. Eat chicken, fish, Mediterranean diet. And then when people do stuff that is the complete opposite, right? No grains, no fiber, fattiest meats possible. To accept that would to accept that maybe everything you've been taught is not correct, right? Because as soon as it's like the conspiracy theory stuff, right? As soon as I acknowledge that there might be one, well, shit, now I got to look at everything,
Right?
right? The moment you say it, so it's easier just to go, nah, I don't really believe it, or I'm not going to look far enough into it to get to the point that I convince myself that maybe it's wrong. I'm just going to pretend it's an anomaly and just go about my business.
Yeah, see, that's why in the documentary, the ability for me to document the GI specialists, not just one, but 2 different GI specialists, the ability to document their level of not only ignorance, but the level of arrogance that presupposed that ignorance, the the unwillingness to even open their mind to the potentiality of what I was even describing. Because in my mind, I try to break it down so fundamental for them in my deduction when I said, how can you tell me that food that enters the very GI tract that is currently injured, how are you telling me that has nothing to do, it's not even a variable to measure with regards to the effects of that GI tract? And their response was, we have thousands of research and decades of evidence to substantiate that it has nothing to do with it. And then 5 minutes later, they'll tell me, but if you have celiac, which my girlfriend has, if you have celiac, that's the only one that can really be remedied with diet. And we don't know why. It's like, it's mind-blowing at the level of ignorance, but it's even more disheartening that I, as a layman, am going in there to get expert advice from the supposed experts, and they're nearly gaslighting me into thinking everything that I knew up to that point. I mean, like I've written a book about eating healthy, right? Like I understand. And funny enough, there's a lot of things I would redact in there because I published it as I got hit with Crohn's. It was the most ironic timing ever. Like I talk about eating fiber in there. I don't demonize carbs the way that I should, right? But I talk about seed oils are shit. I talk about how sugar is shit, how alcohol is shit. So I do enough demonizing of the things that I think even those doctors would agree on. But like you mentioned, the minutia of the things that take more due diligence and research to understand and comprehend, they're so backdated in their knowledge that in their mind, there needs to be at least 20 more years of the sort of stuff that we're looking at, the sort of stuff that they should be looking at, that they look at it as, well, it's too early to tell, or I think you did a good job articulating it a second ago, or they have to admit that what they've been doing for 20, 30, 40 years may not be the right choice. It may not be the best course of action for their patients.
Yeah, and I think that applies to everything. Like I just started reading a cholesterol book, The Great Cholesterol Myth. And literally within, I'm pretty sure it was the introduction, I learned stuff about cholesterol that I have not heard from the hundreds of cholesterol experts that I've seen on social media. Like, did you know there's at least 13 different LDL lipoproteins?
I did not.
And there's 10 different HDLs. That's just what they've discovered. Right? Like, I'm 5 seconds into the book, and I'm like, there's more than, like, I knew there was, like, VLDL, right? Like, I knew there was, like, different particle sizes. But I can go to 10, 15. I could literally find any cardiologist right now. And not one of them would talk about that. And all of them would...
Go ahead.
all of them would talk about how they would make you think that LDL is actually cholesterol. And I'm like, okay, like I get for sake of, keeping it simple for people, that's easier just to call LDL cholesterol. But it's not even freaking cholesterol. Like cholesterol's cholesterol. There's no good cholesterol. There's no bad cholesterol. Cholesterol's cholesterol.
Mm-hmm.
It is what it is. It's like saying there's good glucose and bad glucose.
Right.
It's glucose. Like it's all the same thing.
Right.
And so to hear these people like talk this way, I'm like, man, like, how do we get to this point? And then you realize this is all from the 60s. This is literally stuff discovered in the 60s. It's the same tests we ran in the 60s. And we just do the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, how can we have so much technology. We can go down and look at like all the way to the core of cells. And we're still running these tests and prescribing potentially life-affecting drugs negatively based on an arbitrary number that may or may not be right.
And the outdated science backing it is so outdated that we now know the only way LDL can even become oxidized to then become a small dense LDL that then actually penetrates penetrates the wall, the cell wall, to then be able to actually cause atherosclerosis. It can only be caused by polyunsaturated fats, let alone linoleic acid. And so whenever you start talking to actual doctors about, do you know the difference between LDL, VLDL, ILDL, SD, ApoB versus LB, ApoB? Like when you ask them these questions, you can see on their face the level of ignorance and lack, we'll just say ignorance, the lack of being informed, with regards to that level of minutia. And then it begs the question, if you don't even know how LDL is oxidized, how in God's name can you define it as the catalyst to atherosclerosis?
That's it. So, and people will literally say it's too much LDL. I'm like, well, how does too much LDL, how does that happen? They're like, well, you get too much and then it like bulges and then, no, like the only way you get heart disease is how you said it. It has to penetrate that endothelium, like, which is thin, super thin. And the easier ones to do that are the smaller particles, but they still need to be oxidized.
And then it's the question is, how do they get oxidized, right?
Yeah. And then guess what? You start going back and you're like, oh, it's inflammation. Like, you have these inflammatory, you have free radicals, you have all this stuff. And I realize how broken our healthcare system is, because not one doctor will talk to you about that.
No.
Not one doctor will go through, all they'll say is we have a whole bunch of observational studies that say that all started on a very poor study back in the 60s that was manipulated. Let's be honest.
Ansel Keys, don't get me started.
Oh, yeah. Lionheart study. Yeah, so like, we don't talk about any of that because nobody cares. We don't have time, right? Like, I have 10 minutes to give my best ballpark guess on what drug's going to work best for you. That's literally it. And like, and I showed that when I did my 4K SAT experiment, where I ate 4,000 calories of the standard American diet and ate just much crap as I could to see what would happen. And I had a really bad eczema flare-up. And it didn't cause eczema. I've had eczema since I was, 8 years old. But it caused a really bad one. Blistered on the hands, weeping, like just brutal. I'm like, cool, that's an inflammatory response, right? Like, little side note, there's people that'll be like, the next time somebody says this food's inflammatory, show me what the inflammatory marker is. I'm literally like this. I'm like, it's my freaking hands.
Right.
That's it. And they're like, well, how much do you eat? And I'm like, I don't care how much I need to eat. Why would I care how much it is? If it's causing it, I shouldn't do it.
Exactly.
What? What a novel idea. But anyway, so I'm like, all right, I'm going to go to a dermatologist just to make sure this isn't like out of control infected. Not one question about my diet. I know for a fact this was caused by my diet. For a fact, I have not had anything like this. First of all, I've never eaten like this in my entire life. Like, I had bouts where I did the standard American, right? But I would have good meals and then I would just snack poorly, right? And I gained weight because I would snack whenever I wanted and I would, snack however I wanted. But never once did I force feed myself, thousands of calories of just junk. And this is the worst reaction I've ever had. Like, usually it's just dry skin. This was the first time I've had like full back of the hands, blistering and all this.
And it don't take a rocket science to figure that out.
Dude, like, I've been doing this for a long time. I've been dealing with this for a long time. I have it under control. I just have to put lotion on every once in a while and my hands don't crack and I'm fine. And the moment, a week into eating this way, my hands blow up. I wonder what caused this.
Right.
Not one time. Not one time did they ask anything about diet. I'm like, why? Why are we not? Most of these diseases are inflammatory. You can trace inflammation back to almost everything. So why do we not try and find what the source of inflammation is?
Yeah. Were you able to take a look at the whole documentary?
Not the whole one. I looked a little of your story, but I wasn't able to get the full.
Fair enough. You'll see 10, 15 minutes in, when I first initially start talking to the GI specialists, that even the idea of anything non-medicine being able to be a remedy, so anything lifestyle, in their mind, anything lifestyle being a remedy to what they think only medicine can cover, it's like a whole new language to them. Like, they haven't even contemplated the implications of that because their entire education has been predicated off being an expert in medicine. So when you get past the gaslit feelings of these doctors are making me feel like I don't, maybe food doesn't have anything to do with inflammation. Maybe my intestines are fucked for the rest of my life and I have to be on Remicade, I have to be on Entyvio, I have to be on some sort of immunosuppressant because I'm just screwed. Like, that's essentially what they told me. And in the documentary, you'll even hear I call her GI specialist one. She said, there is no remedy, there is no way to really make your Crohn's symptoms better. other than being on medicine. And I said, so my GI tract being affected by certain foods, you're telling me the foods have nothing to do with it? She said, exactly. Only medicine is going to heal you. And even then, we don't know which medicine. We're going to have to experiment with different types of medications. We're going to have to experiment with multiple, stack them, all this stuff. And my only question to her was, if you're willing to go about that with regards to an uncertain process, with the willingness to experiment with it to find a winning solution, why won't you do that same due diligence with food? Because their whole point when I would bring up the food was, we just don't know. There's too much biological heterogeneity, which just means there's too much. Yeah, right. It's like, you don't need to tell me that. Good thing I knew what that was going into it. They said there was too much biological variance with regards to how humans individually will respond to different incoming stimuli. And because of that, we can't measure the efficacy of different dietary protocols. But we're going to experiment with all these different medications. For me, it was legit the most insane feeling. So I decided at that point I was going to listen to people like you, people like Dr. Robert Sives, people like Anthony Chafee. And man, I can't emphasize it enough, the sort of God's work you guys are doing, being able to educate people in a world where the majority of the educators are stemming from a place of sheer ignorance. They're stemming from a place of not even knowing how to fix the very field that they're in, which is healthcare.
It's so true. Like, and I appreciate the sentiment. So do you remember the drug Vioxx?
I do not.
So Vioxx was a popular anti-inflammatory drug back in the 90s. And then it came out that Vioxx was killing people. And there was massive lawsuits and all kinds of, just as you'd expect from a drug that is extremely prescribed, and there's commercials on TV, and, then people start dying from it. I found out about 15 years after I started, when I was 12 years old, right? So I played baseball growing up, played baseball in college. I would later find out that I tore my UCL in Little League at 11 years old.
Wow.
So I go to a doctor, right? General practitioner. It might have been an orthopedic surgeon. I don't even know. I was too young to even know what's going on. I was put on Vioxx when I was 12 years old, right? First of all, a 12-year-old on an anti-inflammatory drug for something that's sports related. Like it wasn't causing me like crazy pain. I just couldn't throw. Like my arm hurt so bad to throw.
Were you a pitcher?
I was a catcher. So I'm just throwing all day.
Literally.
Yeah. So I'm put on Vioxx. And so I find out, when in my 20s that, all this stuff comes out and these lawsuits. And I was like, damn, I think, and I don't remember how it happened. I got like medical records to go to a new orthopedic surgeon. And I realized I was on Vioxx. I was like, you've got to be shitting me. I was like, how on earth? I'm like, okay. And then I start like getting into it, the last couple of years started getting more and more into this rabbit hole. And I read most of, I'll admit, I didn't finish the entire Sean Baker book. But Sean Baker in his carnivore diet book describes his kind of fall from grace in the medical community.
Mm-hmm.
And it was because he stopped and started looking at root causes. And he started taking longer with patients. He was no longer taking 10 minutes with the patients. He was taking 30 minutes with the patients. And then, number of prescriptions went down, and the number of surgeries went down. And he started doing less and less and spending more and more time with these patients. And then all of a sudden he's spending 45 minutes with a patient. And they started questioning what he was doing. Like, bro, what are you doing? You're not helping people. He's like, no, actually, I am helping people. And I'm helping them by not getting them on prescriptions and not having to do surgeries. And, we're healing some inflammatory issues and like all of these things. And he got taken to the ethics board and his license suspended. And I'm sure there's, there's more to it. There's multiple sides to a story. But at the end of the day, here's a question for you. How many doctors are worried that if they don't follow the script, right? You're 10 minutes a patient, right? Patient's going to come in. They're going to be called back a half an hour after their appointment. They're going to sit in the room for a half an hour. You're going to pop in, see him for 10 minutes. You're going to write him a prescription and get. And you're going to do that. How many times can you do that? 6 times an hour. You take an hour lunch break. You do that 50 times a day. How much of it is doctors think they're actually right? And how much of it is they're like, well, I got to follow my certifying board, otherwise I'm gonna lose my job.
Let's think about it. The majority of doctors are as potentially complacent as just the average person in the era in which they're operating from. They're just like us, except they had the life circumstances, whether it was, good childhood, good upbringing, whatever it is. They had enough life circumstances that guided them in the direction that gave them enough discipline, we'll say, to endure the monotonous, long-winded experience of becoming a doctor. So once they've spent all that time being a doctor, I'm very confident the majority of them from that point forward have I've done my work, I've done the hard shit, I've already done what I'm supposed to do. So now it's time for me to enjoy my career. And I think it takes so much effort to uncondition all the stuff they learned through medical school, namely the small blip of nutritional data they had to undergo, right? The small blip of nutritional studies that they had to experience. In their mind, they get 8 to 10 years deep of getting this career. Once they've got that career, they now are more worried about the next 5 to 10 years of becoming a good version of whatever field of a doctor that they're going to be, whether they're an orthopedic surgeon, whether they're just a general practitioner. In their mind, they now have to prove themselves for the next 5 to 10 years. And now they've already spent nearly 20 years in a very limited echo chamber of information that I think it's almost a cognitive dissonance sort of thing. I think it's a true self-defense sort of survival mechanism in their psychology where they unconsciously do what you're kind of talking about. They unconsciously, I think, are like, I'm not trying to step on any toes. I'm just trying to do what I can do to pass the boards and to do. I think that is an unconscious sort of fuel. But when they're consciously as arrogant and ignorant as every doctor and GI specialist that I talk to, not to mention all of them are pretty fat, I don't think there's enough unconscious excuse to give them with regards to the blissful ignorance. I don't think you can chalk up in my opinion, their malpractice of only prescribing medicine. I don't think you can chalk that up to they're just trying to avoid the Dr. Sean Baker route of being demonized and ostracized by their community. I think it's more so Dr. Sean Baker is one of the few who is egoless enough to look at his field of study and approach it as somebody who actually cares about the truth. And when you approach it from that standpoint, you're egolessly looking at it irrespective of how you feel and what you want the answers to be. And you look at it more so from what is the evidence showing. And I think that takes so much effort that it's extraordinary with regards to what the average person is willing to do. And the majority of doctors are they're no more or less average than the average American. And that's evidence based off their own dietary and nutritional standards. It's based off their own blood panel and their own serum cholesterol and all the things that they're trying to judge other people on while they're drinking a Coca-Cola or a Dr. Pepper. But at least it's diet in their mind, and that's how they try to justify it. So yeah, I think it's least about blissful ignorance, and I think it's more about unintentional malpractice due to a megalomaniac perspective of them not being willing to be wrong.
I think that's very well put. It's like, I did my 10 years, right? Like, and hats off to him. Like, I got out of undergrad and I was going to do a doctorate in physical therapy. I was like, I don't want to go to school anymore. I was like, I'm tired of school.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't. And I ended up getting a master's in an unrelated field just out of, it was a crime of sports administration.
Still.
It was a crime of opportunity. Like, I wasn't intending it, but I was like, all right, whatever. But yeah, like, and I feel like you have your sights set. When you choose to do medical school, like, that's, you're 18 years old, right? When you go in and choose your undergrad major, and it's better being something medicine related. Otherwise you're going to get into med school.
Right.
And then you're like, okay, when I'm 30, then I'll be set. And I'll have, $400,000 in student loans. And that doesn't mean anything to me right now because I'm 18.
Right.
But when I'm 30, I'll be set. And then you get to 30 and you're like, man, I'm finally here. I'm finally done it. I now know more than everybody else. Right? It's that sign that, have you seen that meme where it says, if you come into, my doctor's office with Google, your Google searches don't outrank my medical degree.
Right.
And you're like, well, except for the fact that I've got a lot of medical searches, which apparently do, because like you guys say some silly stuff.
Excuse me, doc, what's LDL if you're such an expert?
Or yeah, like it's all these things. And I'm like, okay, so there has to be this level of I'm smarter than you, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the PhD, right?
That's the megalomania part I was kind of alluding to. That's that
absolutely
narcissistic ego.
Absolutely. And I don't think all of them necessarily do it maliciously.
No.
Right. But it's just this level of, for the longest time, we've put doctors on such a pedestal. Like, you went through all of this work. You have reached the upper echelons of education. You are now elite. And then the internet comes along and we start going, wait a minute, why are these doctors saying that? Like, wait a minute, why did doctors prescribe their favorite cigarettes? What? Why did doctors demonize animal fats and then promote margarine with trans fat?
And why did those same doctors who were promoting all the tobacco and all those big companies, why did they start transferring all their efforts and energy into the big food industry? But that's another conversation.
Yeah, right. Like, wait a minute. Right when people started realizing that cigarettes were bad and doctors were like, hey, we're going to say cigarettes are bad, why did cigarette companies start buying food companies?
Right.
Oh, that's right. Because we're going to now promote sugar as not being bad.
Right.
Anyway, but it's like,
yeah, I don't mean to keep going on tangents. My bad, brother.
No, tangents are fine. Like I'll go red pill all I want. But yeah, like, so you get this level where, and they'll talk to you like that. Like, oh, what's your background? What's your education? I mean, it doesn't take a whole lot of education to be able to read a study.
Right.
Right. It doesn't take a whole lot of education to realize that your nutritional studies are inherently flawed. Like, we cannot keep putting stock in nutrition studies because you just can't. Like, until you find a way to clone people and stick identical sets of twins in a metabolic ward for their entire life and monitor every single thing that they do, you'll never have the answer. All you can do is be like, hey, it looks like this. And if that's all we can do, why don't we listen to the people that come in and say, actually, I have a different experience? Man,
that's why I think there's obviously different influencing. There's a bunch of different ways that an individual can influence the paradigm shifting of the old into the new. And the need for people like the Robert Sives, the Anthony Chafee, the Ken Berry, the Sean Baker, like the actual doctor speaking up is one thing, but I think it's so important that people tangential to the medical community, people like you, people like me. Were you a personal trainer at one point? Right. See, like, I'm still a health I do a lot of health consultations now. So I do one-on-one health consultations with individuals. And that kind of shifted from the personal training route. Because in my personal training, it's like I'm spending 30 minutes doing dietary deductions for my clients. And it's like, we've already spent 30 minutes doing this. We might as well spend the next 30 minutes finishing this concept out, and the next session will work out. And so that ended up turning a lot of my sessions into multiple days a week, where one was isolated for the nutritional schooling and understanding, essentially, and the other was for the actual fitness. And so people like you and I being able to educate others in a position where they almost demonize all doctors. It's like, I'm not going to listen to any doctor if they're all like this. I think it's important that there is that exposition from the other side. And man, I really can't emphasize this enough. This is why I started following you. I remember seeing a couple reels that you had posted, and it was just like popping on my feed, especially when I started going down the carnivore route. And my favorite thing you do, man, is whenever you'll have some dumbass talk about this study says this, and then you go, oh, really? And start busting out all the other studies and really diving into whether it's the methodology, whether it's the statistical significance, whatever the actual shitty aspects of the studies that you're pointing out, it gives the layman who would have blindly listened to that first part of the video you post a different perspective with regards to more information at hand. And I don't think much is going to change until we have more average people, will just say, like you and I, outside of the medical community, doing our due diligence to educate the people around us first, and then trying our best to educate our community. And that's, who knows how long that'll take, because we're fighting an uphill battle against we'll call it the big what is it? The medical industrial complex, we could call it, where you've got big food, big medical, and big pharma. And when you understand the power that those three have as a trifecta, you end up realizing how limited you are in being able to actually fight that on your own. So when you have other people being able to substantiate the claims you make, bro, I've sent so many people your videos, Dr. Anthony Chafee's videos, the dude who did the LDL, Nick, what's his name? He did the LDL Norwitz, yeah. Send people Nick Norwitz videos, because I'll tell them something in a consultation, or I'll tell a family friend during just a sit down, and they're like, there's no way Oreos are better than statins with regards to diminishing your overall LDL. And I go, do you even know what statins do? They get rid of just your LDL completely. So it's like the understanding from external evidence to all come together as an amalgamed whole to then give the actual truth in light of that uphill battle, I think is so crucial. And if I wouldn't have had people like you, people like Anthony Chafee, Dr. Robert Sives, I don't think I would have opened my mind to the potential remedy that I ended up going down, which was the ketovore carnivore sort of route.
Yeah, you realize how limited people's understanding of medicine is. Like, we have this, even me, like I honestly didn't care about studies up until a few years ago, right? Like, I was just like, I just do what works for me. And, luckily I found that in order for me to get in really good shape, I had to cut out processed food.
How did you come to, was it through experimenting with how to remedy your eczema? Is that how you found like certain dietary protocols, or were you finding it online? How did you sort of get to that level of understanding?
So carnivore, so I was a gym bro, right? Like in my 20s, I was an amateur bodybuilder,
chicken, rice, trainer. All that.
Oh, dude, all day long. Yeah. All day long. But I had an understanding that I might not be able to explain it, but I had an understanding that processed food was going to keep me from getting really lean. So if I was going to go on a cut, if I was going to get ready for a show, processed food had to go. And I would tell my clients, I was like, if it has more than 2 ingredients, don't eat it.
Nice.
And they'd be like, well, why 2 ingredients? I'm like, because sometimes they add water. Like it's simple. Like, what about this? I'm like, how many ingredients does it have? Like, it's really, like, I've literally felt, going back 10 years, I felt like Eddie Abu, right? Like, don't eat it. Like, if you're really serious about losing weight, just don't eat processed foods. I don't really care about anything else. Like, I had macros that I'd play around with, but that's was my understanding. And so I tried to apply the same thing when I was 35. I was like, all right, I got to get rid of the dad bod. I had like a 2-3 year period where I got married, had 2 little kids, gained 25, 30 pounds. I was like, all right, I got to get rid of it. And so I did a whole foods diet, like Whole30, but I did it for 90 days.
Nice.
And I lost weight, but I didn't feel good. I was like, how am I cut out all processed foods, right? I eat no junk, no alcohol, no anything. I'm exercising. Why don't I feel good? And it was like my energy was meh, my digestive system was meh. Like, I was like, this doesn't make sense to me. So I was like, well, this is dumb. So I just gave it up and gained all the weight back. And then I saw Saladino, and for everybody who doesn't like Saladino, he's gotten a lot of people onto this path.
Mm-hmm.
And I instantly started feeling better doing animal-based. I was like, that's weird. And I was dirty.
So what'd you cut out initially? Like, what were the foods that you immediately cut out once you came across Saladino? Carbs generally, or
vegetables?
Just all vegetables?
Vegetables. I was the poster child for making huge, like, different ways of trying to get my vegetables in and then letting them rot in the back of the fridge.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't like vegetables, but as soon as I cut them out, I instantly felt better.
Wow.
And I was like, that's weird. I mean, I cut out processed foods again, but I'd already done that. So I'm like, okay, I was still eating fruit, not a ton, but I was eating fruit. I was like, man, this is weird. I'm like, okay. And I wasn't even very strict. Like I'd still snack or have a drink on the weekends, you know. And then I had such good results that I was like, maybe I'll get a little stricter. And then I had better results. I was like, man, what happens if I start cutting my fruit back? And then I had even better results. And I was like, man, like, this is crazy. And so people are like, how'd you get to carnivore? I'm like, I just felt better. That's literally it. Like,
so there wasn't a deduction of watching some content or coming across some information and then eliminating specific things. Are you saying it was more of a let me start cutting out? Like I'm genuinely curious as to, because if it was that intuitive, that's what I explain to my clients when they start realizing how much they actually enjoy red meat, especially my vegan clients who haven't eaten red meat for decades, right? Is I tell them it's natural after a certain point where you'll know what foods to eat and what foods to avoid. So would you say that was more your route? It was a natural discovery of just elimination?
yeah, it was a natural discovery. And then I went to figure out why.
Okay.
Right. So, and I make fun of people all the time. Like, this is probably one of my biggest comebacks. I comment almost to everybody back, whether they're trolling or not, but I do so with a little backhandedness. So people will say, well, show me the studies. And I'm like, man, go ahead, do your PubMed diet. Like, I call it the PubMed diet. I won't eat anything unless I can find a study on PubMed that supports it. I did it backwards. I honestly didn't even research like animal based. I was like, I get it. Intuitively, I get it. Right? Eat red meat. All I'm doing is increasing the fat, lowering the carbs. I'm getting rid of vegetables. Okay. Like, I'll try it. And then I felt so good that I was like, man, why? Like, I heard Saladino, right? You know, plant defense chemicals, all this. I'm like, but why? And then I just kept doing it. And then I kept trying to figure out, okay, what's the reason that it's happening? I'm going to keep doing it, but I kind of want to know why. And then I kind of just got further and further. And then as I kept eliminating stuff, I kept realizing the stuff that was making me not feel good. And then as I had unexpected results like psoriasis clearing up, and again, none of this was bad. Like, I didn't start carnivore to get rid of any of this. This was just like those little life things, right? But as like knee inflammation went down, as psoriasis went down, as acne on my head went down, as like all this stuff, I was like, man, there's got to be something to this. And so then I started, diving in more. And that's when I started getting into the studies and realizing that I was like, these studies are shit. Like, and most people know their shit that are in the medical community. They say it in their papers. You can literally see an author that says, now we understand that there's issues with observational studies and it cannot prove causation. And we understand that it's highly unlikely that a single food is going to cause something. And we understand that these risk estimates are based on FFQs, which have inherent issues with self-reporting. They literally say all this. But then they give you the conclusion, right? And they say for every 6 grams of fiber you eat, you have a 9% less chance of cardiovascular disease. And you go, wait a minute. You just told me your entire study was shit. And now you're telling me that this, and guess what happens? Headlines. Like, we run with headlines, and now everybody goes, I need to eat more fiber because if I do, I'll have a less chance of getting.
Are you familiar with Dr. Dennis Burette from the early 1900s? So Dr. Dennis Burette was essentially the guy who discovered fiber. Dennis Burette was this Irish, but I think he was ethnically Irish, but he technically was from England. He was this missionary, but he was also, I think he may have been a colon doctor. He may have been a colon expert. But long story short, he was a doctor. He was an expert in digestion. And Dennis Burette was wondering why so many people in England were starting to have colorectal problems, let alone cancer, digestive issues, constipation. And this is where, kind of tying what we talked about earlier, this is where I think doctors initially try to do the right thing. No different than politicians, right? They have this vigor and they have this excitement to go out and help the world and help people. But after a certain point, certain interests get involved that corrupt that initial that initial adulation for helping people. So Dr. Dennis Burette in the early 1900s, he was trying to help out people in England get rid of their constipation issues, essentially. And so what he did is he went on a mission. He was a missionary. So he went on a mission, and his way of giving back on this mission, on this trip to Africa, was he was trying to observe why certain tribes in Africa weren't experiencing those colonic issues, let alone the constipation. And what he noticed, I don't think it was, what's the tribe Saladino always references that he went and ate with?
Oh, the
The Maasai.
The Maasai, yeah.
Yeah, the Maasai versus the Akakuyu, right? So, and that's a whole nother conversation we could have with regards to like two specific sample sizes. That's as close as we can get to the twin studies, right? So I don't know if it was actually the Maasai. I don't know if it was a defined tribe in particular, but he followed these ethnic Africans around in the early 1900s and realized their poops were massive. Like he was like, why are their poops so big? And this is where the argument that people that say fiber is needed steps in. They'll say, well, it's because they were eating all these fibers. But realistically, he was observing them at a time of the year where they were eating more tubers than not. So at that point in time of his mission, they were essentially consuming all these different tubers that caused their stool to be a lot more massive. And so in his mind, he was thinking, what is the difference in what they're eating versus what us in England are eating? And however he did the deduction, he ended up deducing that it was the fibrous foods and the difference between the insoluble fiber in England and the soluble fiber that the Africans were consuming. And so he was the one who differentiated soluble versus insoluble fiber and was hinting at his fellow English people to eat more of the soluble fiber because they have been inundated with the insoluble. And that would be a way to remedy their constipation. Dr. Dennis Burette died of colon cancer at the later stages of his life. And if you try to look that up, you'll only see that he died of, I think they'll say stroke, or they'll give other reasons that were essentially caused by the colon cancer. And so they'll try to avoid the admission of how he died because the irony of his death is counterintuitive to his discoveries that he's accredited for. And all these vegan doctors, man, I don't know what his name is, but that skinny neck, glasses wearing vegan doctor that
Greger.
Sean Breaker is always making fun of that.
Michael Greger.
So I watch, and he was one of the doctors I followed early on in my Crohn's when I added fiber in. That fool said he has a picture of Dennis Burette in his bathroom that he looks at every time he takes a shit. And he goes, and he said, like, I worship this man so much because of his contributions to the medical community and our understanding of fiber and how it affects the intestines and blah, 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 that he's worthy of putting on my wall in my bathroom. And it's like, bro, he died of colon cancer. And so these little things, man, like when I discovered those in my process, and a lot of these were discovered when I was experiencing my Crohn's. So I had nothing but time on my hands to really do my due diligence. Bedridden for 14 to 16 hours a day, hardly able to move. I'm pacing back and forth in my living room just to get some movement. I couldn't at that point walk up and down my stairs yet, so I was limited to just pacing in my living room. And during these debilitating times, I would just engross myself in as much data and information as possible. And that's when I came across certain people in the carnivore and keto community that really started educating me on these little tidbits. And that Dennis Burette tidbit, funny enough, I learned from Steve Gundry, of all people. Like Steve Gundry, of all people, was the one that expressed that story. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And Steve Gundry still says that certain things aren't that bad. And so it's like, okay, I can take what shit I don't agree with, that the stuff I don't agree with that you're saying, I can take it with a grain of salt. But there is clearly, like he also got me on the lectins route, right? Different anti-nutrients, we'll call them. So there's pockets of genius, even in areas where they may have some ignorance. And that's where the more educated you are, you can start compartmentalizing the worthiness from the non-worthiness. And then you can take people at their word, even if they are medical doctors, and you can realize, yeah, they're clearly ignorant with regards to dietary and nutritional implications on the body, but they're a medical doctor, so there's something I could learn from them. Let me see if there's anything from their perspective that is at least worthy of adopting.
Absolutely. And it goes the same thing with studies, right? You can still learn stuff from studies, even if they're not a good even if what they have doesn't back up their conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's part of why it's so important for people. You know, I actually have a Norwitz t-shirt that says N=1 scientist.
Nice.
And I'm like, I think it's super important for everybody to figure that out themselves, because I now have a completely different perspective on fiber. I used to take fiber supplements like psyllium husk, right? I choke. Oh my gosh, that stuff's terrible. But I would choke it down because I was like, okay, I need to get more fiber in my diet. And I don't think it ever caused me problems, but it didn't do anything. I'm like, why am I taking this? Like, this stuff is literally sawdust. Like, this is terrible. And then when I went carnivore and stopped eating fiber and everything got better, I was like, okay, so fiber I think is a problem, but why does it promote fiber? And then you start looking at all these studies, and then I did my standard American experiment, and I got constipation, like bad. And I wasn't eating very much fiber. And then I realized, I was like, I think there actually is something to these studies, but it's not in the way that people think.
Right.
When you eat this stuff that your body can't break down, you need something else to get it out. Like, it's almost like a cleanse, right? You don't need to cleanse if it's not dirty in the first place. And guess what? Our standard diet, I do think the average American who eats the standard American diet probably does need to eat more fiber. But all of these benefits that people are seeing, and when you look further into the studies, the people who eat more fiber generally, and this is across all of these meta-analysis, and they say this right in the literature, the people who eat more fiber generally exercise more, smoke less. Like, okay, so what you're saying is the people who generally take better care of themselves are the ones that eat more fiber and eat less junk. So is it the fiber?
Or is it the lifestyle?
Or is it the fact they take care of themselves?
Right.
Right? So then I'm like, okay, so yeah, the average American they would probably benefit from removing junk food and eating fibrous foods. I'll agree. But then as we start going further, and I realize that I don't need fiber, is it really fiber that's the thing we're harped on? And everybody wants to hang their hat on it. You have to have fiber. Where are you getting your fiber? What are you going to do without fiber? Okay, let's talk about what fiber does. Here's the other thing. People don't really know, right?
Well, that's the thing. All of those studies are based off of Dennis Burette's initial discoveries, and they've been extrapolations from that initial discovery.
With no mechanism.
None in place.
Nobody has a mechanism on how fiber works.
No, all they know is your body can't digest it because we don't have the cecum of a gorilla, so it just goes through your body, and we're trying to make assumptions based off of these basic processes that we can observe.
And it feeds your gut microbiome.
It's so stupid.
Which we also don't know much about.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, so that's fine. Like, I get we don't know much about nutrition. So if we don't know much about gut microbiome, then the only things we can extrapolate from gut microbiome is the things that we have decided are associated with it, right? It's a cause and effect. If I have a bad microbiome, it's going to come up in, mental issues, inflammatory issues, digestive issues. So by the same logic, if I have a good gut microbiome and my mental clarity gets better, if my inflammation goes down, if my digestion gets better, then obviously my gut microbiome is doing well without fiber.
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain that? Right? How do we explain everything getting better? And they're like, oh, but colon cancer. I'm like, colon cancer is only because you have all this garbage in your system that doesn't get absorbed and doesn't get out. And I'm like, oh, so how? Like, how are we doing this? And people just want to harp, but studies show. And it's frustrating because people are so ingrained in this. My doctor told me, and there's all of this research which compares a crap diet with somebody who replaced it with some fiber.
So are you familiar with how the stomach lining, essentially how the endochromaffin cells and the epithelium produce enough? What's up, little man? So you're familiar with how the intestinal lining, namely how the endochromaffin cells in the epithelial are the catalyst to producing our serotonin, let alone other neurotransmitters. Like, you're familiar with that, right?
Not super in depth, but I'm aware of like the gut brain connection and how all of that stuff is going to affect literally everything else in your body.
Right. So essentially you have your intestinal line, and this is what's so important when you understand the nuance of your intestines and the state of your intestines, let alone just the lining. So in our intestines, we have what are known as enterochromaffin cells, which are cells that line the epithelial that are the mechanisms in charge for your body being able to produce serotonin. And so if you're serotonergically deficient, which means you'd have to go on an SSRI, right? You'd have to go on a serotonin selective reuptake inhibitor. You wonder how many therapists and how many doctors in the field of behavioral psychology, how much they could actually help their clients if they understood that basic concept. And so I've had clients who were on SSRIs for 10 plus years. And as soon as I explained to them, 95% of your serotonin is made in your intestinal lining. And when you understand that basic fact with regards to where the neurochemical is coming from, you can then ask the question, how can I produce more serotonin naturally in a way that is, how can I repair my intestines in a way that allows my body to naturally produce the amount of serotonin that would allow me to not have to depend on SSRIs? And so seeing a client who was on SSRIs for 10 years, manic depressive, has all the, and again, I'm not a clinician. I operate off of my ministerial license. So I'm an ordained minister. So all of my consultations from a health standpoint stem from the ministerial side of me being able to essentially do what a therapist would do, what a counselor would do, without the limitations of the license. And so I'll sit there with a client who I can't diagnose them right, but they said that they've been already diagnosed manic depressive. They have a therapist that they talk to who has them on all these different SSRIs, whether it's Zoloft, Prozac, whatever it is. And I explained to them, did you know your intestines are going to essentially qualify how much serotonin you have in the first place? And they'll say, no, what do you mean? And that's when I explained to them, you are what you eat. But the deduction of that from a scientific standpoint is one of, if you're eating bullshit that's going to destroy your intestinal lining, that is then going to cause those enterochromaffin cells in your epithelial to not be able to produce serotonin, you're serotonergically deficient so much that the only way for you to be able to feel any type of way is to be able to have what little serotonin you do have be recycled day in and day out through these drugs. And when they learn that, they go, what can I do then to heal my intestines? Ergo, everything we've been preaching. Eliminating all the bullshit, namely the anti-nutrients that are causing those intestines to be degraded. And I like the analogy, I give this all the time with my clients. If you think of your intestines as a piping system, and if your intestines are a piping system, no different than the toilet or the shower that you have in your house, you can realize that the way in which your plumbing, the piping system of your plumbing, the way the piping system in your plumbing system works is one of maintaining the integrity of that plumbing's lining. Because the minute that plumbing's lining gets compromised and there's leaks in the system and you have sewage seeping into your foundation, that is the actual cause to why the house essentially starts having all the problems from a foundational standpoint. And when you learn that certain nutrients act the same way, you then ask yourself, how can I envision what these nutrients are actually doing? And I like to explain it like this. You're familiar with lectins, right? Yeah. So lectins, a lectin for the audience is just a protein within carb sources, namely grains, namely wheat, that is going to react in the body negatively because our bodies aren't designed to process that specific protein. It's no different than gluten, right? It's just the gliadine protein we have more tolerance to unless we eat excess of it to the point where we end up having gluten intolerance, like my girlfriend with celiac. And funny enough, she's second generation Sicilian, so her entire life was just gluten, right? And by the time she hit 20, it ended up cascading where she ended up getting diagnosed with celiac because her body couldn't tolerate the gluten anymore. So whether it's the gliadine protein, whether it's the lectin protein, these different toxic proteins that our body cannot digest, I look at them no different than nails. So if we think about like a hammer nail, If you flush a nail down your toilet, that one nail, as it's hitting the sides of the piping system, it's not really going to do much. But what happens if you take a bucket of nails and flush them down your toilet? Maybe the first time you flush it, it won't be that bad. Maybe that excess of nails isn't really going to destroy the lining. But you flush nails down your toilet every day, you best believe those nails are going to start scratching at the integrity of that lining to the point where it creates these holes that causes leaks in the system, which is no different than these anti-nutrients entering the human plumbing system. Those spike protein, well, I don't want to use the term spike protein because that's a clinical term for that. Those proteins that are spike-like, no different than a nail in the way in which they affect your intestinal lining, will start eroding at that epithelial. It'll start eroding at the integrity of what's keeping all the toxins out of the system, essentially, to where you start getting what is known as leaky gut, because you have all these holes in your system because you're eating these excess anti-nutrients. And so I let these clients know that excess anti-nutrients are the same, that's destroying your gut lining, are the same causes to your depleted serotonin levels. And in order to get you serotonergically efficient, we need to allow that lining to heal itself by not flushing nails down the toilet. So you define for them what are nails, essentially. They eliminate that. Then they're at a point where their intestines have time to heal. Then they get to a point where they can produce serotonin naturally. Then they get to a point where they're off SSRIs. And I've had a handful, like legit 10 plus clients who were on SSRIs, and legit a handful of them were over the age of 50 and had been on SSRIs most of their life.
It's something I could find you hundreds of people who have gone carnivore, keto, low carb, who have done the same thing, off SSRIs, off antidepressants, off all of this stuff. And yeah, so at the risk of turning this into a 2-hour podcast,
right.
This has been awesome. I really appreciate you coming on. Where can people find your documentary, and find you, website, social media handles, to get more information and some of the content that you produce?
So Self-Sustained Training is my brand. It's my company that I personally train people out of, and I also do my consultations. My website is sstfree.org. And on that website, I have multiple videos that teach you about food, that teach you about posture, that teach you about base biomechanics, which, man, we didn't even get to biomechanics. I knew you were a baseball guy and a physical therapy guy, so I really wanted to talk about like biomechanics. We'll save that for another day. But you can go to my website, sstfree.org. The documentary is also on there. But if you just type in How Keto Cured My Crohn's on YouTube, you'll find it. My Instagram is at mitch.thompson, mitch.tomson. And realistically, Facebook and Instagram is where I post most of my stuff. But for anybody that's out there, irrespective of following me on social medias, irrespective of watching the documentary, on my website, there is free content for people to be able to absorb information that at least gives them a catalyst to exploring all the stuff that you and I essentially embarked on our own. So it's essentially just an initiator for them to be able to really start discovering how they can be healthier. Other than that, the documentary, if you have any sort of autoimmune disorder, it's a perfect prime example of what nutrition and lifestyle can do in the face of the medical community telling you you would need to depend on medication. And I took no medication. I suffered through the entire Crohn's experience, and through having faith in the carnivore / keto sort of approach, I was able to find light on the other side.
I appreciate you coming on. It's a great story. I highly recommend everybody go check it out. I appreciate everybody who tuned in, and we'll see you guys next time.